MH370 is a mystery, but more specifically, it's a murder mystery. It's an action carried out by a perpetrator with nefarious intent. That's a lens that we can use to look through at the evidence to try to have a better understanding of the case. As you know, this is a podcast that's all about trying to understand aviation's greatest mystery, trying to gather as much evidence as we can, trying to call on the knowledge of leading experts in different fields. But it's also about trying to find new ways to frame what we've gathered, to understand it in different ways, to see if we can use different viewpoints to gain a fresh perspective. In episode 28, we talked to Ed Densell, who in a previous life worked making magic tricks for stage magicians in Las Vegas. And he helped us understand the practical psychology involved in getting inside the audience's perceptual loop to try to create an erroneous expectation, which then you can subvert. Today we're going to do something similar. We're going to apply a different lens to look through, which is similar to a magician, which is a psychopath, a fraud, and we're going to see how someone with that kind of psychopathic criminal intent can do something similar to what a magician does, which is to get inside the perceptual loop to create false expectations, false narratives, so that the subject does not understand what that person is truly doing, and that person can get away with their criminal intent. Now, why? I was basically inspired by a Netflix miniseries that I really enjoyed called Ripley, which is based on the Patricia Highsmith books, The Talented Mr. Ripley. She had a whole series of books about this con man, Tom Ripley, who is a fraud, ultimately a murderer, but who kind of weaves this web of deception to fool the authorities and to get away with his crimes. Well, why are we talking about this in a show about MH370? Because as somebody who constantly thinks about MH370, I was watching the show, really enjoying it. It's very stylish. The performances are fantastic. It's just a really gripping narrative, very moody, very evocative of this time, very stylish. But I was watching a show about this person who deceives, who creates this web of deception, and I was really struck by the parallels that I saw between that story, which is fictitious, and the confusion and befuddlement that we experience with MH370. And we know that MH370 was carried out by somebody on board the plane. We know that they had an intent to deceive. And we are left, like Tom Ripley's victims, befuddled and unable to understand what's really going on. And so I thought this would be a really neat way to apply that lens. I really wanted to talk about this with someone who is an expert in the genre of murder mysteries. And so I reached out to the co-hosts of a really wonderful podcast called Killer Fun. The co-hosts are Jackie Armandi and Christy Norman. And what they do is every week they watch either a true crime show or a fictional murder mystery, and they talk about it. They break it down. They discuss how the story unfolds, what the clues are, what the motives are, how ultimately the case gets solved. And so Jackie Armandi, who also teaches psychology, so she could bring to the show both her knowledge of the craft of storytelling and the craft of depicting criminal mind, and also the actual psychology of how the human brain really works, and talk with me about how we can learn about the deception aspect of MH370 by talking about a really fun and entertaining show that aired on Netflix called Ripley. I had a lot of fun talking to her, and I think you will too. Hi everybody, Jeff Wise back with you for another episode of Finding MH370. For those who haven't seen the show before, I am an aviation journalist. I was featured on the Netflix documentary MH370, The Plane That Disappeared. I also wrote a book on the subject called The Taking of MH370. once again, if you enjoy the show, you can subscribe. If you subscribe, you can also now join, which is a really neat thing. I'd like to thank some of the people that have done that, particularly Fran Sanfrisco, which I don't think is a real name, but I love it. Michael Boyle and Alexander Wood. Thank you guys for supporting the podcast. If you want to go over to the show page at findingmh370.com, you can also sign up and support us there. If you sign up, you can get a weekly newsletter. And also we have all the shows from Season 1 and Season 2 to date. And you can read more commentary about each episode there, too. So without further ado, let's get on to my fascinating conversation with Jackie Armandi. So I'm very excited to have Jackie Armandi here with me today, co-host of the Killer Fun podcast, which is such a great idea. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the idea behind the podcast.
It starts as most things do, sitting around a table and just chatting about the things we love, which in that case was true crime and all the crimey TV shows, Criminal Minds and all of those. And so the more we talked, the more we realized how we enjoyed talking about it.
Right.
And then one day she says, I want to do a podcast. And it just went from there.
And she being your co-host.
Yes, Christy. Yeah.
Christy.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys are great. It's so fun. So the reason that I got interested in this topic is because I think obsessively about MH370. I think about all the different angles of it. And so everything I experience, I sort of see through the lens of this great, important, abiding mystery. Mm-hmm. And so I was watching Ripley, this show on Netflix, which, full disclosure, my wife works for Netflix. Okay. And so I have a real appreciation of the stuff that they do. I was in a Netflix documentary about MH370, and so that was a bit of a family affair there.
That's cool.
But an aspect of MH370 that a lot of people don't realize is that we don't know who took it. We know that somebody on board the plane took it. The captain is widely suspected, but it's not the only possibility. But whoever did take it did so as an act of deception. They were trying to fool or thwart people from finding out what they were doing, definitely at the time. And maybe they were trying to avoid being caught ever, like they were worried about what people would find out later. When I was watching Ripley, I was fascinated by this. It's all about a guy who is a con artist, fraudster, psychopath, whatever you want to call it. And it's really about deception. It's how do you deceive people to a remarkable degree. He basically deceives an entire country. It's a remake of the Patricia Highsmith story about the talented Mr. Ripley, Tom Ripley. She did a whole series of books about it. And there was a very famous earlier version, a generation ago, with Gwyneth Paltrow and Jude Law, that a lot of people might have seen.
We loved that so much. When they decided to redo it, we said, really, do we need to redo this one? But it is a totally different take and a different lens. The new one, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of full disclosures. You didn't love the remake. I did love the remake, so we're going to have to be at odds a little bit.
That's true. You know what? I have a whole moratorium on film noir to begin with. Like, this is a thing. If it's film noir, I am a hard sell, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, and the other full disclosure is that there's going to be a lot of spoilers in what we're going to talk about today. And so I am torn because on the one hand, I really am kind of a proselytizer for this show. I think people should watch it. So I guess my advice to you, listeners and viewers, is pause this, go watch this series, and then come back and hear us talk about it. Because if you're interested in MH370 and you're interested in film noir or just murder mysteries in general, I think this is going to be a good one for you.
Yeah, no doubt.
So, Jackie, the reason I wanted to talk to you is because having seen Ripley, I was like, I need to talk about this with somebody. I need to talk about this with somebody who knows this kind of stuff. And you spend a lot of time. You really love this kind of crime genre, true crime, fictional crime, just kind of talking about the devious, deceptive, evil things that people do to each other. So you spend probably a lot of time talking and thinking about deception.
I do. I think it's because I spend a lot of time thinking about emotional intelligence, um, just in general. So on our show, we have a psychology break, right? And then we dive into the different aspects of psychology that sort of come to the surface through the show. And I teach general psychology at the college level. So I spend a lot of time talking, even with my students, about emotional intelligence. But it takes high emotional intelligence to be successfully devious. And so that's why it's always of interest to me, I think. Yeah.
That's really interesting. One of the ideas I want to talk about is this idea that in the art of deception, which includes crime, but also includes things like magic
Yeah.
and maybe even storytelling, you're trying, when you're telling a compelling story, you are bringing someone into a false narrative that they're buying into. And so you're creating a narrative that is enticing, that is appealing to the listener and invites them to participate because really believing a narrative isn't just passive. You're not just hearing something and kind of passively accepting it. You are creating that in your mind. So deception is a kind of a dance, a kind of joint creation between the deceiver and the deceived. And to create something that's compelling, to create something that the believer wants to believe or is willing to believe. On the one hand, we tend to think of rationality as like, okay, here are the facts. Do the facts match?
Yeah.
But I think in real life, you're the psychology expert. In real life, we're motivated by many our beliefs are motivated by many things, and probably least of it is whether it actually fits.
Oh, I think we want to believe that it matters, that it fits, that it's objective, that it's congruent. But actually, our brains, we literally process information differently based on whether it is already congruent with what we're bringing to the table. So, and we can demonstrate this through research. So Stroop tests sort of measure that. So when things are naturally incongruent with us, we have a different reaction. Sometimes that's how we get down to implicit bias, right? We have implicit bias. And there are interesting, fun, free tests you can take if you want to look at that to see what kind of implicit bias you might have. But we do all come to the table with it. So if you're looking for deception and you're looking for truth, you're always going to be, lining it up against with what you already congruently believe to be the truth, want to be the truth, whatever the motivation is in that, which is why investigation has to be so checklists, based. It has to be so, regimented and have process that makes it, really take it out of the realm of the gut. It can't be just the gut. We'll fall to our implicit bias.
So the Stroop test that you mentioned involves asking people to read words like, you'll say to people, what is the color, say the color, say aloud the color of the word I'm going to show you. And if you show them the word red and it's red, they very quickly will say red. But if you show them the word blue, that's written in red characters, people kind of like they have sort of like automatic processes that are working at cross purposes, and they have to kind of do mental traffic control, which is effortful, it's slow, and people don't like it. It's actually tiring.
Yeah, people do not like it. And so in addition to that, we can go to what's called an emotional Stroop test, where now we're looking at things. So if you might have heard of the famous gorilla experiment, you can go to YouTube and you can look this up. And they ask you to count how many passes are made between the individuals. This is a reimagined, more modern version of it. And so you have your person counting the passage, of the ball throughout the people. And in the middle of it, there's these different things happening. And so at the end, it says, did you notice this? And it's like, wait, what? And then
people are
they can
shocked
go back.
that their attention doesn't include things that would, in retrospect, you'd think would be obvious, like a person in a gorilla suit walking through the middle of the game.
Yes, so it's a selective attention test. And the same sort of thing can be done for an emotional Stroop test, which is going to be an indirect way of measuring our emotions. So it's looking for that congruence, incongruence that is driven by selective attention in the same manner. So
this is stuff that you can read about in a psychology textbook, but people with high emotional intelligence, or people who make it their business to deceive other people, who do this professionally, whether overtly or intuitively, will use these principles. And so we're looking, and so in the case of MH370, we're trying to solve a real life mystery. We're trying to understand the hallmarks of deception that we see in this case. And so we're going to kind of use Ripley to teach us about how does a deceiver deceive. So I wanted to talk about this show a little bit.
Good stuff.
So just to sort of summarize the plot, we have a man named Tom Ripley who is living in Brooklyn in the 50s, and he is a con artist. He's like a kind of a low-level grifter. He steals mail and steals people's check payments and then writes them letters threatening them, making them pay him. And we can tell that he's like living in a shoddy apartment. He almost gets caught. It's like not going well for him when a rich man, Mr. Greenleaf, summons him to his office and says, I want you to go to Europe to track down my son who's like living high on the hog and like won't come home. And so I want you to make him come home.
Terrible job.
It sounds like a pretty sweet job, especially if Jude Law is involved or Gwyneth Paltrow. This one is a little bit less glamorous. We can talk about that maybe a little later because I want to talk about the scene where Tom Ripley gets recruited. Mm-hmm. He is sitting in a bar and a guy comes up to him and says basically, Tom Ripley. And his reaction is quite interesting because he doesn't know what this person thinks he is, right? So he kind of has to just sort of say as little as possible. Yeah. He wants the guy to tell him who he thinks he is so then he can then be that person. Yeah.
Wait till they're volunteering more information and then fill the shoes that they've been presented to you.
Right? And this gets back to this idea we were talking about before where like, tell me what you want to believe and I will tell you that. It's very easy. Mm-hmm. We were talking on the phone earlier, and I was telling you about, I did a story for Maxim magazine many years ago, back when Maxim was kind of a thing. And they asked, so there was a lot of interest at the time about the secrets of lying. Like, most people are interested in detecting lies. Like, how can I tell if someone is lying to me?
Right.
But Maxim was kind of a naughty magazine, so they turned it around, and they wanted to know, how do you be an effective liar? And I talked to all these psychologists, and there's all these things about, like, keep your story simple and, like, look people in the eye. But the real secret of being an effective liar is incredibly simple. It's just tell people something that they want to hear.
Yeah.
And people... And so this is what Tom basically does is he goes to... So he basically hears who this guy thinks he is and says, yes, I'm that guy. He gets summoned, he gets sent to Europe in this role that's basically saving him from his life of like probably winding up in prison or broke, either one. And he goes over there and he has to kind of insinuate his way into these people's lives. Mm-hmm. And it's basically mirroring, you kind of mirror whatever the expectations are to be the person that you... And is this something that is common in kind of crime stories?
Yeah, I mean, we hear, especially with serial killers, we hear about their charm because you're thinking, how in the world did we not get the creepy vibes and stay away from this person? But we do a lot of things for good and for bad, right? We mirror in order to create rapport, but it's that mirroring that we do literally. As in, if you're standing, or you're sitting, and I'm going to mirror this, and I'm going to do the same thing to create familiarity, comfort, safety. And so then I crack something funny. I'm using emotional intelligence to sort of be a thermostat, not just the thermometer. I'm not just going to read the room and the temperature. I'm literally going to start to change it slowly. And that's how it starts, is the mirroring, the rapport. So.
Right. Mm-hmm. And something that's fascinating about that, I think one of the things that really struck me about Ripley, as someone who always thinks about MH370, is what's so important to his deception is that there is what I call a paucity of evidence. There just is not that. He's leaving as few clues as possible. And this is a period piece. It's set in the 50s, and it could not take place today, where we have so much information. We have our cell phone data. We're always pinging cell phone towers. We've got our credit cards telling us. I mean, there is so much data about us that it's very hard to pretend to be somebody else. That would come to light very, very quickly. But he's in a time where people send telexes, they write letters, and there winds up being a set of people who know what Dickie Greenleaf looks like. Tom winds up pretending he murders Dickie Greenleaf and then pretends to be Dickie Greenleaf, gets access to his bank accounts, is spending Dickie Greenleaf's money. He forges his passport so that he can check into hotels. And a lot of the excitement and tension of this show is watching how he almost gets caught, but manages to use his cleverness to not get caught. But it all hinges on one group of people knows who Dickie Greenleaf is and looks like, and another set of people, like the bank and the police inspectors coming after him, only know him from his letters, his bank statements, and things like this. And so this is also true of MH370, where because of an event that we don't really understand, somehow the satellite data unit, the SATCOM system, was turned off and turned back on again. And was turned back in such a way that we only have this very, very thin skein of evidence, which means that there's nothing to confirm it. Yeah. And this gets back to like believing the lie that you want to believe, or believing the narrative, I should say, that you want to believe. Because if you only have one piece of evidence, but it lines up with what you want to believe.
Yeah, with the narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. We don't seek to disprove as much as we ought to.
Right. Well, we don't. Yeah, because we only kind of put on the skeptic's hat.
Yeah.
If it really is going against the grain of what we want, if it's causing us discomfort, if it's causing us inconvenience, right?
Yeah, this is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias 101, right? We're looking for the things that confirm our preconceived notions and beliefs. And often there's other biases that play a role. So in investigation, it's the first sort of theory that seems to make sense. And then because that's the first thing, for whatever reason, a whole host of biases that could create that, then we are now looking for information that continues to prove that theory when we should be looking for information that disproves it.
Man, that is so relevant here, because basically what happened in this case is that officials, we saw in an earlier episode that the Australian officials really quickly became convinced that it was the captain had done it because the Malaysian authorities told them that that's what they thought. And ever since then, they've never been willing to consider the possibility that there might be another narrative possibility. And I have seen it just informally with the people who write emails to me or reach out to me on Twitter, where they say, "Oh, I know what happened," or "Watch this podcast. They tell you that they figured it out." There's a real urge to find the solution and say this is the best solution. Yeah. And a lot of what I've been doing over the last 10 years is to try to shake people out of this mental mindset and say, listen, this is not a beauty pageant. It's not like there's, all these different lovely, beautiful models that you can, and then whichever one you like the best, that's the right one. That's the one you should cling to. People have this really unfortunate tendency to cling to the narrative that appeals to them the most. And they sort of form an identity with it. It's like, this is what I believe. And therefore, if you're attacking my belief, you're attacking me.
Oh, yes. And that's a problem on so many levels. Yeah, that's a problem. When we believe something instead of, hold a theory, right? We take it into our personhood. Yeah. And then it really is. It's a short stop from the, disagreement to you're against me. This is zero-sum games. That's not fun.
But it's like the Stroop test where you see something and you want to just call it that. Our brains are designed to process like trillions of pieces of information. I made the number up, but a lot of information per second. And we don't have time to question what's true and what's not. We just have to kind of take everything at face value unless there is a big error signal. Our brains are built to detect error, but that error has to be pretty big for us to turn the full weight of our conscious attention to that thing.
Yeah, it has to be important to us.
Yeah.
A lot of times we stick to the narrative that's easier. We might even say, oh, it's Occam's razor. We might say,
Yeah.
the KISS, keep it simple, stupid. But
Right.
really it's because overturning it would be an inconvenience to us on some level.
Right.
We need to find that it's important to us to find the real answer. So the families of this flight, they probably want a full answer, unless they're too tired of dealing with it.
Yeah.
And then it's like, give me the easiest one. And then we use Occam's razor as almost a scapegoat for our
Right.
convenience. Because a lot of times it might seem really complicated until we gather all the information. And then maybe it was a more complex, but it wasn't all that not simple. It's just that we didn't have the data because we didn't go looking for it.
That's really interesting. So in my ongoing interest in the psychology of deception, I had a really fascinating conversation last season with a guy Ed Denzel, who for years made magic tricks for stage magicians in Las Vegas. And he had all kinds of great insights about how do you make people believe something. And one of the ideas I talked about with him was something that I had first read in an article, and I believe it was Smithsonian, by the magician Teller, the one who doesn't talk on stage, although he writes quite loquaciously. And Teller made a really interesting point, which is that if you let people think that they're discovering something on their own, that lie is impenetrable. They will believe that with 10 times more fervor because they think there's no way that this was artificially put in my way. I discovered it. And I was really intrigued to see this idea echoed in Ripley in a scene where so Tom Ripley has pretending to be Dickie Greenleaf, has led this whole life in a rented apartment, and he's been very solicitous towards the landlady, who seems lonely, and she seems kind of smitten with him. And as he leaves, when he leaves the apartment, he writes her this long, heartfelt letter, very emotionally open, very much confiding in her, and basically implying that he's going to go kill himself. And so he writes this, and you don't really know why he would do this, but later Tom Ripley gets cornered by a detective, the same detective we met in the first episode who went to recruit him. This detective corners him and says, listen, we know what happened. We know the truth. And not for the first time, we see Tom like on the precipice of being caught and exposed and ruined. And we think that this is it. But then the detective, this is such a spoiler, the detective says, we found out what happened. We found a letter that Dickie wrote to his landlady, basically saying that he was despondent and about to commit suicide. And so he left this clue for them that they found, and they didn't, it seemed like nobody had intended for them to find it. And so they are like, this is the narrative. And so at that moment, we feel like, okay, he's scot-free because they have bought into it 100%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how this relates to MH370 is that the plane sent out these 7 signals, which the authorities were able to recover from Inmarsat's databanks. And they couldn't at first make sense of what they meant. And then they realized, we have to invent this new math. But once they had understood what this math meant, they were like, okay, we have found this ourselves, and therefore it must be perfectly true. My reaction to that is these were signals that were sent from a box that was manifestly tampered with. It was turned off and turned back on again in a way that no airline captain ever would know how to do or be motivated to do. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just absolutely fascinated by this idea. And I've had Inmarsat scientists explicitly tell me there's no way that somebody could have known that we would be able to do all this fantastic fancy math. Nobody is cleverer than us. And this might be another idea, this kind of getting back into kind of like the sort of emotional ways we process information. Maybe you could tell me if this is something you've encountered in your studies and your viewing, your podcast viewing, this idea that there's no way the perp could be smarter than us.
Famous last words.
Is that something that you've actually encountered, that kind of idea where the perp gets away with it because people don't give him credit for being smart?
Oh, definitely. Playing dumb. Playing dumb is a powerful tool. These things always cut both ways, right? But even you could take this back to philosophy, right? Psychology was born out of a desire to take philosophy and make it scientific, right? So Socrates, let me ask the questions, let them underestimate the components. So you see this all through sports psychology, as far as and competitive game theory. There's a lot of places where we talk about how do we estimate and how do we have confidence in the ability of our opponent. So letting others underestimate you, this is powerful in healthy competition, right? All the way down to the pool hustler, who poses as somebody. And so the people who are looking at the unsub, right, or the perpetrator or whoever is at fault, it's easy to think that we're the smart ones because we're the good guys, and the good guys must make us smarter. But not so much all the time.
It's such a male thing, I have to say. Do you think it's a male thing?
There's maybe some gender differences.
I feel that the people who write to me and say, I get a ton of emails from people who are and just tweets and stuff where people are like, you can just see them rolling their eyes and they're like, this is so dumb. We know what happened. You should watch this podcast that I saw. It makes it obvious what happened. And people are just so put out that I would even suggest that the idea that they have could be wrong. It's really frustrating. And I know that all the people who said they were going to find the plane, I don't know. I've been told that they actually made fun of me by name when they all got together to review the progress of their studies.
Oh, wow.
And it's they find it so inconceivable that their basic concept could be wrong.
Hey, that means you've made it.
Yeah, right. That's what I tell myself.
That's a good thing. Keep telling yourself.
To get through the day. That's what I tell
That's
myself.
Good.
But can you think? I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you think of any cases either in fiction or in true crime where somebody just wove a web and they didn't get caught? I mean, I'm thinking about do you guys do The Usual Suspects?
Oh, I mean, let's Kaiser Sose the heck out of this, right? I mean,
right?
Yes, of course. We love that movie. I love that movie for sure. It's funny you speak of gender differences, and honestly, it's often the female perpetrators who are underestimated. So one of the most prolific, and I'm having a blank on her name right now, but it was in the Victorian era, and she poisoned. She used poison, and the way that she did it, it was a network of women who would come to her to get poison, to poison their husbands. This was just the whole shtick. She had created a line of cosmetics, and through word of mouth, if a woman came to order things from her table, wherever she was set up, and ordered a specific item, that item was the poison. And there were some rules, and this lasted, I mean, she has thought to have been the cause of death for hundreds of men, husbands, killed by their wives who were looking to become a widow rather than divorce, because, in those days they would not have been able to survive. So, and just the whole underestimate, they just never believed that the wife could have given poison to the husband, always assumed to be some sort of illness. Talk about detectives not catching on. It wasn't until there was a guilt-stricken wife who told the first responders of that day that she had poisoned out of guilt. That was the only way. Because nobody ever questioned.
There's a couple of cases that are sort of potentially related to MH370, where you had Russian intelligence operatives pulling off things, hacking in one case of a computer network on the one hand, and on the other hand, figuring out how to make these urine collection vials for the anti-doping agency. Basically pulling off feats that were so clever that the victims of these crimes their initial thought was this is not possible. They couldn't have done this.
It's not possible.
I mean, people will probably also know about the hacking of the Enigma machine, where there were clues, actually, much to their chagrin. The Allies realized that despite their really aggressive attempts to prevent the realization that this code had been broken, they would even let ships be sunk because they didn't want to risk letting the Germans figure out. But there were clues, and the Germans were on the cusp. Some, I believe, high officials in Germany did actually harbor suspicions that Enigma had been broken. But basically, the Germans didn't think that the Allies could have broken the code. They didn't think that they were that smart.
I mean, it goes back to even like our European theater operations with the Army troupe that was actually from Hollywood for actors. And they actually were very helpful in creating a distraction by creating a false battle using pyrotechnics, props, inflatable tanks, all of these things to create an illusion that there was fighting on the front line way down the river. So that, the response would be driven that way, and that so our actual, Army soldiers could cross the river further north. And so, the illusion of that and the ability to, and it wasn't just because it was good, although it probably was pretty good. But it just didn't take much.
They recently made a movie about an attempt like that, where I actually mentioned this in the book I wrote about MH370, the taking of MH370. It recounts the story of in World War II, they took Allied intelligence, British intelligence, took a body of a guy that just happened to have died, and they dressed him up and put like fake ticket stubs in his pockets, and they gave him these documents that were supposedly about how they were going to invade Sicily or something like that. And so there was recent, and then after I wrote the book, a whole movie got made about this incident, but it really shows how there were some doubts. People are like, wait, actually, there's something isn't this a little convenient that we found this body that washed up? But it gets to this idea where a body washed up. It didn't walk into the consulate. We found the body. So,
we found it. We came up with that idea.
And so it's the same thing with like finding these signals. Oh, we found these signals. And like, I'm sort of raising my hand and saying, well, you found it, but these signals were actually made as a result of an action that somebody on board this plane did. And another idea that Ripley made me think about more is the idea that all of the clues that are found are clues that were under the control of the perpetrator, whether they're bank statements or letters. He always has to be in control of what information people are receiving. And when that gets interrupted is when he's in the greatest danger. When he runs into someone by accident or someone shows up unexpected in his apartment, that's when he loses control over the distribution of information, that's when he's at greatest risk. He doesn't control it anymore. And all of the clues, there's basically two sets of clues with MH370, these electronic signals and the debris. And I've argued that both of these things are under the control of the perpetrator. And so you should always like put a question mark over those things. And so this leads us to, I think, a really interesting part of the Ripley show, which is encountering a skeptic. So we've talked about how most people are just happy to go along. So Dickie's girlfriend Marge should be in a position to be really skeptical of everything that's happening. It doesn't match. There's so many things that don't match what she would expect, and yet she kind of realizes, well, my book is. I might be able to publish my book because I'm attached to this murder mystery. So she kind of like actually benefits from the way things are unrolling. But there's another character whose name is Freddie Miles. And Freddie Miles is a kind of a fairly, not a close friend, but an associate, and they have a sort of a tradition of getting together over the holidays. Freddie Miles shows up unexpectedly at this apartment that that Tom Ripley has been renting under the name of Dickie Greenleaf.
Right.
And he's like, wait a minute. And he notices things that nobody else notices. And
Yeah.
that's what's... He notices that Tom is wearing Dickie's shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you have to have an eye for clothes, I think, to really be able to tell, oh, that's that brand of shoes. He recognizes that the shoes that Tom's wearing are very, very unusual. They're, in fact, one of a kind, handmade. He has a pair, and Dickie Greenleaf has a pair. And he starts to get suspicious. And once a person becomes suspicious, the whole MO doesn't work anymore.
Right. Right.
I mean, so much of this kind of thing really depends on, like a magician too. To get back to Penn and Teller, they had a show where they would say, fool us. You show us your magic trick. And if you can fool a magician, because we know all the little ruses and all the tricks and all the misdirection, you might be sort of inducing your audience to look over here while you're doing something over here. A magician, presumably would know better than to do that.
You would think, yeah.
You'd think. But so this is a real crisis for Tom, because he's got this guy in his apartment. And he's basically rumbled him.
Yeah. Well, and the evidence is important to Freddie. The shoes, it matters. He owns a pair, right? Like,
right.
It's that first clue that's really congruent with something that is important for him. You know?
I think that Freddie Miles also had, and something I've encountered as a journalist, you just get like, the hair on the back of your neck goes up. You get a sense, you get a smell. There's a thing involved in MH370 where people are constantly reaching out to me about this UFO video, where there's these 3 orbs that are circling MH370, and then MH370 goes through like a time portal or a galactic interdimensional portal. And I watch this and I'm like, you have to be kidding me. Like, this is, to me, it's just like every fiber of my being is like, this is fake. But so many people are like, it looks real to me.
Well, video often does look real, I mean, shoot, they made a whole show off of that, so it's not a bad idea.
Wait,
I mean, I really liked Manifest.
Oh,
it's a good show.
It's a fictional show.
That's
I was just writing.
plot.
I sometimes get a little mean. I get a little short because it's just I can't really understand why it is. It's a little bit frustrating, but the mechanisms in our brains for wanting to believe are so powerful, powerful.
Yeah.
And it's very, very difficult. You were mentioning Socrates earlier. I mean, this idea that like you can wouldn't you agree that virtue is the most important thing that a man can have? Of course, Socrates. No one would deny that. That's not how real life works at all.
Not well. No, it really doesn't. And when you encounter someone who is a little like that, like somebody who has studied psychology or philosophy, it is almost frustrating. I feel bad for my husband. He has to live with me. And, it's not fun being married to somebody who studies psychology. But just for that reason, because the skepticism, the suspicion, the desire to get to the truth, it actually can hurt our social fabric.
Right. That's right. We need to have, there's kind of the white lies, the social lies. Yes, your hair looks great. I love your new haircut.
Great.
We don't need to be ruthlessly truthful all the time.
No.
But so when the narcissistic, psychopathic, deceiver encounters someone who doesn't believe what they're laying down, they're suddenly powerless, naked, undefended.
Yes.
And what happens when that occurs?
Entrenchment.
Okay.
People double down. And they do it with stakes that are far less sensitive than what we're talking about.
Right.
Such a crime to the degree, that we're talking about. But people entrench. What happens is your belief is challenged. And when presented with the evidence to the contrary, rather than having a growth mindset, taking in the new evidence and then saying, okay, well, then where do we go from here? People do the personal attack thing. They feel personally attacked. So they double down and they actually will almost restate their belief with more fervor, even in the face of evidence that is literally to the contrary. And that's where the good faith conversation breaks down. And so that happens in relationships, but it certainly happens at, this kind of criminal level.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm thinking of the song "It Wasn't Me."
Yes.
Yes,
exactly.
Where it's just they go through this ridiculous litany of like, she caught me in the shower, she caught me in the kitchen, she caught me, she caught me, and all you have to say, man, it wasn't me. And there was, of course, that Richard Pryor line, was it, "Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?"
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, we see this a lot in politics. I won't get into that right now, but this idea of just, if you repeat it forcefully enough, people will, well, how can you possibly be? We have this, I think, the mental model that, because we've seen all these crime shows where, like, the person is confronted with a surprise witness on the witness stand, and they admit it all, because we have to roll credits, basically. It's a sort of narrative convenience.
Right.
But in real life, when a liar is confronted with the truth, and their guilt is manifest, and the story falls apart, and the consequences are looming, I think sometimes what happens is violence. In the case of Ripley, we see him confronted by Freddie Miles.
Yeah.
He's like, "Oh, you think that, huh?" And he, like, picks up an ashtray, and he, like, bludgeons him to death. Later, we see him confronted. Well, we think he's being confronted by Marge. She has found, this is actually a great example of the way that people make themselves believe. She's staying with Tom at his palazzo in Venice, and he's out for a bit, or he's not paying attention, and she starts rummaging around, and you think, oh no. And sure enough, she finds the signet ring that Tom stole from Dickie's dead body. And you're like, oh my God, she's found the ring. She's rumbled him. She's figured it all out. And we've already seen what happens to people who are alone with Tom when they try to tell him that they know the truth. And he actually picks up that same ashtray. And we know that she's going to confront him and he's going to kill her. But then she says, I found Dickie's ring. And Tom says, yes, I didn't want to tell you, but he gave it to me because he wanted me to have it, and I think, and so she buys into this idea. Oh, maybe Dickie killed himself and oh my God, I understand that. It means that it actually reinforces the narrative that Dickie was suicidal because he gave you this valuable ring. So he doesn't kill her. But I wanted to talk to you about this idea that when a narcissist's lies are debunked, violence happens.
Yeah, I think it's when control breaks down. If he still has control, because so many of the lies are really wrapped with truth. So that makes it hard to parse. So, there's lack of confidence. For instance, it's very common for somebody who is suicidal to give away things that are very meaningful to them. So it's plausible, right? So it's not enough to break it away, which means he still has control. Tom still has control of the situation. It's when he doesn't have control, when he doesn't have the truth that he can weave with the lie. That's when he knows it's not going to be a good enough lie. It's not going to hold power. And that's the power dynamic shift. And that's, I think, when people choose violence, is when the power dynamics break down or they shift.
Right.
Yeah.
We've seen in Russia, Putin basically was trying to win Ukraine by trickery and various stratagems and little green men and hacking and misinformation and all this kind of kooky KGB stuff that Putin did just by kind of training and disposition. And ultimately, it didn't work. He wasn't getting the results that he wanted. And he just had to friggin' invade. He just went in. And now there's 500,000 dead Russians, and we don't really know how many dead Ukrainians, but probably a lot, definitely a lot. And so you're getting on towards 1 million dead people because you just your deceptions didn't work.
Yeah, and then there's entrenchment. Now I have to win, right? If I'm the person, if I'm Putin, now I have to win. There's no way to get out of this and save face. There's none. And I can't help but think of what you're talking about. Air crashes and air disasters, right? I mean, Korean Airlines 007, right? Like this is, the pinnacle of entrenchment. Russian Soviet plane shoots down a Korean Airlines plane. It's kind of on accident.
Oh,
And they
yeah.
just entrench and lie and hold it, and they
Yeah.
keep the secret all for decades
Yeah.
before it finally comes out and the truth comes out, only when it's so far away from it that there's not a risk of losing face,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Well, in the case of MH370, 4.5 months later, you had Russian military intelligence shoot down the sister plane of MH370. More recently, the Prigozhin's plane blew up in midair.
right, yeah,
And so there's all kinds of violence that occurs when you can't really use your deceit and cleverness to do it. Jackie, I want to just touch on one final point that you've been very generous with your time and patient with my ramblings.
oh, I enjoy it. I'm here for the ramblings. In case you don't know, we released podcast bonus episodes of all of the trails that we didn't have enough rabbits to chase. So
Oh, that's really great. That's really great. So, the to me, like, a lot of the electricity and drama of the show revolves around the necessity for Tom to keep these two sets of people separate. These two are sort of A and B lines separate. Like one set of people knows Dickie, knows him personally, and the other set of people, as I said, only know him as Dickie Greenleaf and know him through the papers and stuff that he's leaving. And so keeping those two things apart is essential. And by luck and stratagem, he manages to keep that going. And you think at the end he's basically gotten away scot-free.
yeah,
Until the very last shot of the show, which is when the police inspector, who, by the way, I think is really the most wonderful character, so great of a character. He receives a book, this book that the Marge character has been like struggling to publish the entire series. She finally publishes this book because of the notoriety of Dickie's murder or suicide or whatever, the great mystery. And he opens the book to see the dedication, and there's a picture of Dickie Greenleaf, and you see on his face that he recognizes that's not Dickie Greenleaf. That's not the Dickie Greenleaf he knows. And we're kind of left to imagine what kind of events would have unfolded after that. But the collapse of these two narratives, the collapse of the A and the B, is the solution. Is how a crime gets solved. Like this is the catharsis, the end state, the final. It's like a joke is kind of like the solution of a mystery, right? It's all about our kind of two contradictory ideas kind of folding together.
yeah,
In the case of a joke, it folds together in kind of an absurd way.
right,
And in a mystery, it's like, oh, all these clues that we had that we couldn't make sense of, they suddenly collapse into a shape that makes the puzzle pieces all fit together, basically.
right.
And I think that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast. We're trying to. The podcast is called Finding MH370 because we're hoping there's got to be a way. This plane disappeared because of a specific sequence of events that somebody carried out, and we have all these clues, but we're looking at these clues and they don't add up to a picture that makes sense. If they did, we would have the plane. So,
right. Yeah.
And so, but people kind of, and people are resisting for whatever reason. I guess this is what this whole episode has been about, is how people resist and are misled from seeing, but also internally themselves mislead themselves from letting all of the pieces fall together, from looking at things from such an angle that all the things come together.
Yeah. I mean, you can't help but think of like the end of Breaking Bad, you know.
I didn't see it.
But
that's okay.
Gosh. Yeah.
I don't think I'm gonna.
Well, that's your next assignment.
All the pieces come together in there.
Yeah. Well, his narratives collapse, right? The worlds begin to collide, but then we watch the slow collapse over time of all of this that he's built. The power dynamics finally shifting and out of his favor, and out of his control, and how that all comes together. And so you're either going to have a shift like that where the puzzle pieces kind of, it's not necessarily just about the puzzle pieces, but we're like almost the third viewer, we're the narrator, and we can see like, aha, we're watching how it all collapsed. We're having to use theory of mind to put ourselves in the shoes of those who are in the midst of it and figuring out those puzzle pieces. Or it's going to be a full-on M. Night Shyamalan, I see dead people. And, you know, and either way, it's the tension, it's a payoff. And I think that's why we're drawn to these mysteries, right? We don't want it to like rest in this unknown. We want to know, because for some reason it's kind of entertaining any way it goes, despite the tragedy, despite, you know, the sadness.
But, you know, I guess that's what's so interesting is that on the one hand, you have an urge to say, oh, I heard what this story is. That's the ending. I already know how this movie ends. And but also to maintain the tension of, no, actually that story doesn't hold up. There are actually so many flaws in that story. We have to be willing to not know. And that is something that a lot of people resist. And I think maybe the part of the art of the storyteller, the mystery writer, is to make it very clear to the reader that they might be pointing in a certain direction, but almost certainly the direction that you're pointing. If Agatha Christie makes you think that the milkman did it, you know for sure the milkman didn't do it.
Right. Exactly. You know, and that is unfortunately the trope sometimes is if you read enough of this stuff, you start to see the misdirection a little bit. But, you know, I think holding the unknown is so important. It's part of a growth mindset. You know, there's kind of this idea that, you know, in higher education, particularly, that the more you learn, the less you know. And the more we learn about certain mysteries and the less we know. But that's how we actually get to the end and unravel. If we think we know it, it's less entertaining, actually. It's the shows that I can predict the ending, I can predict the trope, that it's much harder to entertain me in that case. You have to keep some tension. I have to not know. I have to be okay. So if I'm going to enjoy it, you may have to just force yourself to not know a little bit, so that there is a tension, right? There has to be some sort of tension to resolve.
That is such a perfect encapsulation, I think, of where the MH370 mystery stands today, that I think we should just call it good right there. I think that is like, put a frame on it, hang it on the wall. Like that is exactly where we're at. We need to discover that sense of discomfortable sense of not really knowing. And being willing to like get your Miss Marple on and really figure out how you can assemble a narrative that makes sense. Jackie, I want to thank you so much. Can you remind our listeners and viewers how to find your podcast?
Definitely. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. We do not necessarily do video, so just check us out, Apple, Spotify, you know, all of those. It's called Killer Fun. Find us on the socials. We're Killer Fun. We explore the intersection of crime and entertainment. So we are crimey, but we're also lifestyle. So come check us out. Talk with us about the art imitating life, or life imitating art.
That is really fantastic. Okay, well, Jackie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm going to keep listening to your podcast because it's so much fun.
Oh, good. Yes, please do. We look forward to it. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Okay, thank you. Once again, thank you to Jackie. That was a really fun conversation. And watching it again, I thought, okay, I did most of the talking. Sorry, Jackie, but I'd love to have her back on because she really knows psychology is so important to this case. So once again, thank you to Jackie. And once again, if you would like to support the show, like, subscribe, you can now join us at the show page at findingmh370.com, where you can get a weekly newsletter and commentary about each episode. That's all I have for you today, so I'm going to leave it with my words I always say, which is don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. See you next time. Bye-bye.